with this, I would like to request Seema Chishti to speak a bit and give an opinion on the issue.
Thank you so much, Dharani. I'm going to thank you for calling me to a forum which I deeply respect, and speaking from deep inside the hinterland. I wish we had more Dravidian power guiding India. So, we think of the Dravidian hope every day almost. So I'm going to come to this from a very different point of view. It's related, but it's kind of different, because I think we're facing corruption in India of a very deep nature, which almost threatens the existence of a liberal democracy as far as institutional independence goes. So I think a lot of what I'm going to say is probably broadly going to apply to some developing countries, but very specifically, I want to focus, with your permission, on India particularly. So there is this very fine scholar, Professor James Manner. He's based in the UK, and he always he told me, and he said this on record, and I quoted him in something that I wrote. He said, you shouldn't worry too much about institutional independence or institutional collapse. It appears like that because it's always inversely related to the power that the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, exudes in a place like India. And as and when, it's like an electric charge. So whenever the Prime Minister's office will cease to exercise that kind of control and power, power will flow back to the institutions. But that has got me really worried because, and I think of what Samuel Johnson said in the context of a second marriage, that it's, what is it but the triumph of hope or experience? So I certainly hope that in a post-powerful PMO era, we'll have India's institutions doing their job. But as of now, I think the prognosis is quite grim. The one thing that I want to emphasize, and I choose my words carefully, is that particularly in a developing country like India, institutions are seriously important if we have to allow democracy to be what our superbook, the Constitution, intended to be. So, because we almost sometimes we're at a situation, and which is what we found from, the World Values Survey, we found it from our YouGov polls and from other research and credible research and data, that our social institutions often, whether it's family, kin, caste groups, which exist and exercise a lot of hold, actually pull away in a completely different direction from our constitutional values. So institutions in a place like India matter much, much more, if I may say so. And it's time we accepted it. I think a lot of us, and me included, did not really accept that for a long time. But when I look at the figures and I find that many in India would support a dictatorship or an army rule, we're talking about very basic things. So, all the institutions, whether they're investigative agencies, whether it's the media, civil society, or the judiciary, is actually pulling in a completely different direction from what is seen as to be the impulse of people. In fact, I'm surprised that support by Indians for civil rights is lower than what it is in Pakistan, China, or Russia. And, the YouGov polls, where they talk about young people, the millennials, etc., we find them deeply conservative. And in terms of interfaith marriages or anything marriages and other points of view, their approach to money, stability, they are very conservative. The most shocking thing has been the most recent Pew research that talks about approach to gender. And this is where we find that 2/3 of those surveyed, and I think it's about 30,000 people were surveyed, thought that wives must listen to their husbands. And this includes the women. So I think from what we're looking at in India is sort of caste associations, groups, and a basic commitment and the acceptance of graded inequality means even those who are being repressed and oppressed are happy to subjugate themselves and believe fundamentally, lots of them, a significant portion of them, do believe in inequality. So the role of institutions is much more basic, and and I wish we had the problems that Professor Sergi was outlining. It's it's much more important than perhaps in other of situations. There's this brilliant paper by this Oxford scholar, Professor Taruna Khetan, called "Killing a Constitution by 1,000 Cuts," and it's really eloquent, and it's also very specific. And what's really good about it is that it's seen as a very a muddled, a very qualitative approach to it. But he's actually managed to quantify things, to look at it almost surgically, and talk about how the institutions of various kinds have been subverted from 2014, and the very standard political science balance, which is actually it's a lived reality in India, and it was. So, however, bit of a shambles it was, and it was not doing brilliantly, but it was functioning. The executive kind of vertical accountability, horizontal accountability, and diagonal accountability, all of that seems to be in a bit of a chaotic kind of situation. And, when we talk about in terms of, say, the central investigative agencies, which are very good things. I mean, all countries should have an enforcement directorate, an income tax department, a DRI, a Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, National Investigative Agency, etc. But the amount of executive kind of overload on that and moving them to use them for almost kind of perpetuate their stay in power is actually puts India in a very dangerous space right now. And there is actually an analysis on this in December 2021, which NDTV put out, which talks about how since 2014, agencies have targeted 570 of BJP's political rivals and critics, and only 39 individuals linked to BJP and its allies. And the category targeted the most is politicians. They find 257 politicians have been targeted. And this is a 340% increase from what happened under UPA 2, where they targeted only 85 individuals or groups who were seen to be critical of the Congress party. And they targeted about 17 people, so this works out to an average of 17 cases per year. The average of such kind of a pursuit of central agencies is 75 cases a year under the Modi government. And we had a very classic kind of it's really a laboratory case of a perfumer being targeted by the central agencies in UP, which is India's largest state, going to the polls. And it seems that they got the wrong perfumer. So then they went and got the right perfumer, who was apparently the opposition. He's an MLC of the opposition party as well. And that became quite laughable. I mean, I would have laughed too if it was not such a grim story. So I think at that time, if you have an environment like this, where there's this kind of a witch hunt, I think that augurs very poorly for India as an investment destination for those outside or even from within. It's like a complete snuff for any kind of entrepreneurial spirit or anything. A second dimension, one is, of course, this executive overreach and control of institutions, is fishes and loaves and kind of willy-nilly governments playing and finding support in individuals who run institutions. So you have a Chief Justice of India who's appointed as a governor of a state in 2014. And then you have a Chief Justice who's nominated as a member of the upper house of parliament within 4 months with no cooling period. You have an enforcement directorate officer, a very senior, important officer looking at critical, sensitive cases, who within minutes, it's not even kind of days or weeks or even 4 months, is immediately inducted as a candidate fighting the election for a very powerful ruling party in UP. And the same thing happens with a police officer, an important police officer. You also have the Comptroller, Auditor General, a very high-profile person who gave us 2G, being immediately appointed to head, the bank's board, bureau, and advising on something which was up for, he was up for something which the executive chose from. So I think that, plus the other thing that is happening with crossing people across institutions. I mean, all institutions are not perhaps meant to be silos, but they're meant to be kind of separate because they exercise and they play their role because of checks and balances. But if you start kind of having judges who are in parliament without any time being allowed to flow, or you have the union law secretary who was actually a judge earlier, then he becomes part of the executive, and now he's again been nominated to be a judge in the Delhi High Court. So you have a very sort of, I think, a worrying situation where, as I said earlier, because in India, you need modern day institutions if you need to have liberal, just even the basics of liberal democracy intact. So I think this is where it's corruption of like a very deep kind and something that's deeply kind of worrying. So of course there is people surrender, that, officials who man these institutions are happy to, they were roaring about like tigers when you had different kind of a government, but right now they are pretty much not even in a meow kind of scenario. They don't utter a word. And we've also been afflicted by an additional problem of having a TN Seshan or a Kiran Bedi when she was a police officer. Or, this sort of Vinod Rai also has a Batman syndrome, that we're roaming the streets of Gotham. And I think that also is a dangerous sign for our institutions when individuals kind of arrogate to themselves, the role of being, people who will go out and do these things. So personalities get more play, and the institution kind of suffers. So I think my way out of this, to kind of end this, the big burden of doing all this, of doing the cleanup, or of probably rescuing India from, or restoring some kind of institutional heft and a balance, would be on state governments. Because I think the center very clearly draws executive power from the fact that it has popular support. And the only other institution that can also claim to also have political support is state governments. So I think state governments today and our federal structure is burdened, perhaps unfairly so, but unfortunately, I think that's the only perch from where we can somehow navigate India back to being on some kind of a balanced scenario where checks and balances, a proper modern institutions set up, the integrity of institutions can be restored. Because I think a lot more than just kind of financial, corruption, or the economic environment is at stake. And I think we're pretty rapidly heading down a slippery slope, but I'm confident that our federal structure will be able to restore that. So I don't necessarily mean a political federal front, but I think states as they are institutionally, if they can stand up to GST, to financial difficulties they've been put under, or other strange rules which make bureaucrats completely subservient to the whims of the center, I think they will probably navigate us out of this. And of course, the people of India, should they make different choices when vertical accountability is sought to be exercised. So that's about it for me.
Thank you so much for your fascinating speech.